everyone, it's Alexis with Project Management Made Simple. In this video, I'm going to answer the question, how do you identify negative project risks? Now, I want to highlight specifically that we're going to be talking about negative project risks if we use the definition from the PMBOK guide of what a risk is. It states that a risk is either going to be something that happens that affects your project that could be negative or it could be positive. If it is a negative risk, it's also considered a threat. If it is a positive risk, it is considered an opportunity. Now, some of these techniques and strategies I will employ to you all can be something that you can apply to opportunities, but that will be another video that I get into more detail. This video is specifically going to be around the threats to a project and ways to identify those threats. So when we're starting off identifying project risks, you want to use what is called a risk register. And in this risk register, it's going to contain information around each of the risks that you identify. Things like the summary, what the impact to the project would be if the risk comes to fruition and becomes an issue. What is the probability of the risk turning into an issue? What's the severity going to be ultimately to the project if both of these things are high, for instance? And then also, what is your risk response going to be? Now, in this video, we're going to focus on identifying risks, but in another video, I will detail for you all how to go through that risk assessment. So using something like a risk register will be very beneficial and helpful to you when you do this first step in the risk assessment of identifying risks. Another thing you can consider when identifying project risks is to inspect any assumptions that were made. I like to use the rule of thumb that an assumption is a risk. Plain and simple, an assumption is something that has not been validated, right? If it's been validated, it becomes a fact. It no longer becomes an assumption. And with every project, we have assumptions, right? Maybe around our resources and how much time they will be allocated. Maybe having the right resources. If we're working on a software project, then we're definitely going to want to make sure we have a programmer available. If we don't, that project's not going to come to fruition, or maybe we have to outsource parts of it. So any sorts of assumptions that are contained within the project, you can start by looking at each of the knowledge areas. So taking a look at your scope, taking a look at your schedule, your budget, and what are the assumptions around these things. Now, assumptions sometimes are not always made explicit, and some of this comes with experience of being a project manager and knowing the common assumptions that come across projects. One of the things that I see a lot of is, or a very common assumption around, is what our resource planning is going to be. Now, many times resources are not staffed on one project, and so with that, we have to be aware that if something goes wrong or if something happens with another project that resource is working on, and then that becomes prioritized over the project that we're working on, we need to have a game plan and a strategy in place for how we are going to address that. So in identifying risks, when we look at our assumptions and when we unpack those even more to see what are the source of these assumptions, have any of these assumptions been made in the past and they didn't actually come to fruition, that is going to be a good source for you to know where there's potential risks to the project. Another place that you can identify potential project risks, threats, are going to be looking at lessons learned. Now, these are also known as retrospectives in the Agile Scrum world, but it's pretty much the same thing. Even if you're using the waterfall methodology, doesn't matter. In any case, when we're doing project management, we want to document our lessons learned. And so with previous projects, there may be something that was done similar to your project before. And so in that case, hopefully in your organization, depending on how large the organization is, depending on how defined the project management processes are and kind of storage of information, you may be able to return to an archival of lessons learned to be able to see what have other teams learned while doing a similar project. If they had faced certain challenges on that project, being able to assess, are these potential projects that are these potential challenges that we may have to face as well? Is there a way to completely avoid those challenges or to mitigate the impact of those challenges? And also asking the question, once we get into another video with a risk assessment, being able to ask the question of, depending on the impact of these risks, we may decide to not actually move forward with the project. So risk identification is key. Another source of project risks and identifying project risks is going to be talking candidly with your team. Now, depending on, again, I feel like I say this a lot, depending on the organization, just depending on the team dynamics here, I find, and also just individuals' personalities, there's not one right way to do this. If an individual that you're working with on the team is pretty shy, or maybe has worked with other teams and they spoke up about risks and people didn't like talking about risks, you really want to assess, then risk identification is going to be a little bit harder in that situation. So you really want to get a feel for what your team is like when it comes to risk. Asking them questions, straight out, like, what are risks to this project? Sometimes are not the most effective. But when we phrase our questions asking instead, what could potentially go wrong here? What is something that we are, going back to assumptions, what is something that we're assuming about in this particular task that you're working on? Particularly if you're thinking about tasks that are on the critical path, that's a whole nother video, but just basically thinking about tasks that are very important to the project, that if they slide, if they go off schedule even by one day, they are going to impact the rest of the schedule for the project. Looking at those tasks, talking to your team members, understanding what could go wrong with those tasks. And it's not only a matter of what things can go wrong with the tasks that could be risk to your project, but that's just what I found for my personal projects, is that when I'm working on my project team, they're a really good source of being able to assess what risks there could potentially be on their task, but also if they've worked on similar projects before. So there's a lot of overlap between these ways to identify risk, but your project team is definitely going to be one really good source, especially if they're the type of team to be vocal, to be upfront. And if you're finding that some team members don't really have that personality, feel free to, talk to some team members one-on-one. Sometimes people don't want to showcase the potential things or talk about the things that could potentially go wrong. I think that's another subject entirely in terms of risk culture and how risk averse a team may be or an organization may be. But definitely use your project team, lean on them as resources to help you identify what those risks will be to your project. So my final point here is going to be inspecting your project constraints and understanding why they are constraints. I have a video talking about the project management triple constraint that I will have linked below in the description box. And in that video, I share the common constraints that we come across in any project: our scope, our schedule, and our budget. Now, with every project, it's typically the case that one or two of these things are more of a constraint than the other, which I know can sound kind of like an oxymoron, but if you watch that video, then you'll understand the context there. And so really, if we're understanding that on a project, our budget is the true constraint, we want to look at, why is it the constraint? What happens if we do exceed our budget? And again, this might be a conversation that is kind of can be a little bit uncomfortable to have depending on the individuals that you're working with, but it is your responsibility as a project manager or as the person doing the risk assessment to go through and identify what are the things that could go wrong. So if our budget is the true constraint, we need to ask the question, what could go wrong if we exceed our budget? Is there any contingency plan? Are there any funds that we can pull from elsewhere? Now, that's not something that we want to do, but when we ask the question, what happens if we exceed our budget, that will give us more insight into what are potential risks that we haven't thought of in doing these other steps that I outlined for you all. This was a video answering the question, how do you identify negative project risks, also known as threats? I hope you found it helpful. If you did, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up, and I will talk to you in my next video.